Well, Henry read a great verse just now. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Now, when you hear words like that said, what comes to your mind almost immediately? Oh, you got something, Henry? What do you think it is? Yeah? When you hear somebody say, don't be afraid, probably somebody's afraid, right? That's why they say that. For somebody's probably afraid. And you'd be right if you thought that. You see, what's happening in our story is actually based on the verse just before the one that Henry just read. In verse 16 of that passage in Matthew 26, in verse 26, I said 16, I don't know why I said that. The disciples proclaim, it's a ghost. Now, why in the world would they say something like that? Well, to understand the story, we need to actually go back to the very beginning of this chapter in Matthew chapter 14. You see, at the very beginning of this chapter is whenever Herod had John the Baptist beheaded. And so right after that, Jesus has gone to a place, a quiet place. He wants to be alone. And I can imagine that he's feeling a little bit of the weight of the loss of John the Baptist. But you know what happens? The people see where he's headed, and they go to meet Jesus there. And this is that famous feeding of the 5,000 that takes place. All those people show up where Jesus is. The disciples want them to go find food somewhere else, but what does Jesus do? He says, no, you are going to take care of them. And then he makes a meal for all those people out of 5 loaves and 2 fishes. When the meal's over, Jesus gets the disciples, he encourages them to get into a boat and go to meet him on the other side of the lake while he dismisses the crowd. And when he's dismissed the crowd, then he goes up to have that quiet time that he's been anticipating having. And it says in Scripture that he goes up on the mountaintop to pray. Well, in the meantime, the disciples, they haven't really quite made it to the other side, because whenever they set sail, they sailed into a very strong wind. And I can tell you, I remember very distinctly how we were shown this when I was in the Holy Land, that the wind comes whipping through those passes, and that calm water becomes a horrendous storm. The waves get high, the waters get rough, and that's what they encountered on their little journey across the lake. Now, what Scripture says is shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to meet them walking on the water. Now, let's think about that for just a second. It's easy for us to read passages like this, and what do we say? Well, Jesus can do anything he wants to do. But look at it from the disciples' perspective. I mean, shortly before dawn, are you ever out during that time? Shortly before dawn, the light is not powerful enough to help a person see clearly. Just before dawn, whenever you look out and see stuff, it's a little distorted. You can't really make it out. And the evening is the same way. But if you combine the fact that the disciples had no idea that Jesus was going to meet them in the middle of the water, and the fact that they hadn't made it to the other side, it's easy to see how they might have thought that they saw a ghost, because what does it say? The light. When they looked out across the water, the light was just enough where they saw the form of a human being walking on the water. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was out in my boat and I looked out and I saw what looked like a form of a person walking on the water, I might think it's a ghost. Now, interestingly, in my GON magazine, I shared this with my Seekers class this morning, there's a spot in that magazine I get once a month, and they're trail cams. They take pictures of some of the neatest nature stuff that you'll ever see. And this month, this October trail cam month, spy cam they call it, there's 3 pictures taken like, bloop, bloop, bloop. It's their cam, I guess, takes it every so many seconds. And there's a cloud. And it's right here, and then it's right over here, and it's right here. 3 pictures in a row. Looks just like a ghost. Now, I'm sure it's not. And actually, John Polston explained today probably what that is. And it's a very difficult, intricate kind of explanation, like John can do. So he can tell you about that after church if you want to know. But these disciples did not expect to see Jesus, and especially somebody walking on the water. Now, how many of you, when I said walking on the water, thought immediately back to that video that Josh made not too long ago where he looked like he's standing on the water? You remember that? They stopped the video right there. He showed he's standing on the water. But if you remember, when you play the video through, he falls in the water, right? He just did a little more gracefully than I did. But we all fell in the water, and there's no walking on the water. Nobody expects to see somebody walking on the water. And so I think that their fear probably was justified. Interesting, the fear did not end there. The fear did not end there. Because what does Peter do? You know how Peter is. He's got to go try something, right? So what does he say? Jesus, if it's you, let me walk out to you. And it says that he began walking to Jesus. But then he recognized what was going on around him. He took his eyes off of Jesus, and he began to sink. And that's a famous line, Jesus, help me, for I'm perishing. Did Peter have reason to fear? Well, I think he did. And I got to tell you, water is a powerful, powerful force. And if you don't know what water can do, I would advise you not to try to find out. I invite you to read some stories. Now, 10 days ago, a couple from California went down to Maui to enjoy Hawaii. And they, at 12:30 on the 20th, an 8-foot wave swept over them and pulled them out into the ocean. And they drowned. This past Wednesday at Huntington Beach, a brother and sister jumped from the pier, 40 foot, jumped into the water. Now, a surfer was able to save the woman, but the brother perished. He drowned. Water is a powerful, powerful force. And there's all kinds of things that we can fear or be afraid of, but what I want us to do is not dwell on that aspect of this. I want us to look at Peter's life. Look at this timid and fearful disciple, and fast forward to Acts chapter 12, verses 6 and 8. It says, and when Herod was about to bring him out, that night Peter was sleeping bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, and the guards before the door were keeping the prison. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone in the prison, and he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, arise quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. And then the angel said to him, gird yourself and tie on your sandals. And so he did, and he said to him, put on your garments and follow me. Now around AD 42, Herod was trying to please the Jewish people, the Jewish leadership. And so he had the idea to go on the offensive against the Christians, and he went after the disciples. And he captured James, the brother of John, sons of Zebedee. He captured James and had him put to death. And then likewise, he caught Peter. But it just happened that catching Peter coincided with Passover. And he didn't want to get the Jewish leadership upset. He didn't want to do something terrible on Passover, and so he had to put it off a few days. But on the eve of the day that the night before Peter was to be executed, that's when this angel showed up to help him out. Now, the people were praying for Peter, but here's what you need to understand about Peter. At this time in his life, he was more than just a disciple of Christ. He was more than just an apostle of Christ. He had become an anointed leader of the Christian church. He was respected and he was loved by all those within the church. And Herod, by killing Peter, would deal a mighty blow to the Christian movement at that time. The scripture makes a point to tell us how fervently the church was praying for Peter. And so on that night, Peter was chained between 2 guards, chained to one over here and chained to one over here, and there were 2 guards at the door to keep anybody from escaping or being rescued. That's how the Romans did it back then. And Peter, this timid, fearful apostle that we just read about, he's sound asleep in the prison cell. The angel has to wake him up. Do you see the transition that's taken place in his life? Oh, that we could all be like Peter and be so trusting of Christ that we could sleep peacefully every night and not worry about what's happening in the morning. For Peter wasn't worried. He had made that transition. He's not that scared person anymore. Ghost on the water? No, that's just Jesus strengthening his followers to be the light.